The moment everything changed was when the woman at the entrance smiled at me, clipped a badge onto my jacket, and said, "This one is for limited access guests, sir. Family and premium access is upstairs." I looked down, expecting some harmless mistake, but the words were printed clearly in black against a pale cream card, "Limited access guest." My younger brother was getting married that day, in a venue I had spent 20 years building with my own hands, and I was being told which doors I was allowed to walk through. I remember asking her, very quietly, who gave those instructions. She hesitated, glanced at her clipboard, and said, "The groom's office handled the access categories." That was when I understood this was not confusion. It was deliberate. It was organized. And it was meant to put me in my place without anyone having to say the ugly part out loud. But what they didn't know was that the badge was not the worst thing waiting for me that evening. The badge was only there to keep me away from a truth they were hoping I would never see. I was 62 that spring, old enough to know that public disrespect rarely begins in public. By the time a man is humiliated in front of a room, the decision to do it has usually been made in private weeks earlier, maybe months. I had been a husband for 33 years before I became a widower. I had been a businessman longer than I ever planned. I had been the kind of older man people called reliable, which sounds flattering until you realize how much of your life can disappear into carrying things for other people. I lived alone in the house my late wife, Ellen, had loved, though alone is not exactly the right word. Grief has a way of staying in a house like another quiet resident. Her garden was still outside the kitchen window. Her reading glasses still sat in the drawer by the den. Some mornings I still turned my head half an inch when I said something aloud, as if she might answer from the next room. My days were simple enough. I got up early, made tea, checked the weather, and drove to Hawthorne House, the old brick property on the edge of town that had become one of the better event venues in the county. People like to call it elegant now. When I first bought it, nobody used words like that. Back then, it was a tired building with cracked windows, water damage, and enough structural problems to frighten sensible men away. Ellen was the one who told me old buildings and tired people had one thing in common. If you gave them steady care, they could still surprise you. So we rebuilt it slowly. We restored the stairs, opened the courtyard, salvaged the original floors, and turned a failing shell into a place where people came to celebrate beginnings. Weddings, anniversaries, charity dinners, retirement banquets, company galas. I had good staff by then, and I was no longer lifting tables myself, but I still showed up most days because there are places a man ties his life to so completely that leaving them feels like abandoning part of his name. My younger brother Adrian was 14 years younger than me, and that gap shaped everything between us. By the time he was old enough to think the world owed him explanations, I had already learned how little it explained. Our father died when Adrian was still a boy. Our mother did what she could, but pain and bills are cruel partners, and somebody had to stand in the doorway and hold things together. That somebody was me. I took extra shifts. I handled school forms. I drove him to practice. I taught him how to knot a tie, how to shake a man's hand, how to keep his mouth shut when anger would only embarrass him later. When he nearly lost his college place over unpaid fees, I covered the deposit. When he bounced from one bad apartment to another in his 20s, I helped him with rent twice, and repairs more times than I can count. He had charm, even as a young man. He knew how to talk himself into rooms. He knew how to make people feel chosen. I respected that. I also knew charm can become hunger if a person starts measuring his worth by the kind of room he can get invited into. I never kept score, because that's not how I was raised. For years, Adrian and I were close in the ordinary way brothers can be close without talking about feelings like they belong in a shared language. He worked with me at Hawthorne House for a while, mostly on client relations. He was good at it, better than me in some ways. I knew how to keep promises. Adrian knew how to make people excited before the promise was even fulfilled. Brides liked him. Their mothers trusted him. Corporate clients liked his vocabulary. He could take a regular package and describe it in a way that made people feel they were buying status rather than linen and lighting. Eventually, he left to start his own event advisory firm, and I backed him the way older brothers often do when they are trying not to turn support into debt. I guaranteed a loan he swore he would never make me regret. He hugged me in the parking lot and said, "One day I'll stand on my own." I told him I hoped he would. The truth is, Adrian had always carried a kind of hidden embarrassment around me. He loved me, I believe that even now, but love does not cancel pride. In some part of him, he hated that our family history looked steadier because I had held it together. He hated being introduced as my younger brother in rooms where he wanted to be seen as a man who had made himself from scratch. I noticed it in little ways over the years. The faster he rose socially, the more carefully he edited out the parts of his story that involved needing help. He stopped telling the college deposit story altogether. He stopped mentioning that Bell Street, our mother's old house, had stayed in the family because I covered taxes and repairs after she passed. If somebody praised Hawthorne House in front of him, he would say, "I helped shape the business side," which was true enough. But truth can be trimmed into vanity if you cut off the supporting edges. When he met Chloe Vale, I thought maybe marriage would settle him. She was smart, well-spoken, polished without being cold, at least at first. Her parents, Richard and Denise, were another matter. Richard owned a packaging company and sat on boards in the way men do once money starts giving them extra posture. Denise had the soft smile of a woman who evaluated people before deciding whether to become warm. They were not openly rude in the beginning. People like that rarely are. They simply make sure certain questions hang in the air longer than they should. What schools had we attended? What communities did our family move in? Was Hawthorne House fully under professional management or still largely founder-led? That sort of thing. Chloe seemed embarrassed by some of it, and I gave her credit for that. When Adrian announced the engagement, I was happy for him. I meant it. He looked proud in a way I had not seen since he was younger. He asked if the wedding could be held at Hawthorne House, and I said yes without much discussion. I gave him a family rate. I told my staff to make the week easy on him. I waived several upgrade charges he did not even know I had removed. Ellen had always believed weddings were one of the few times generosity should arrive before being asked. I tried to honor that. The first small crack came over photographs. We were in my office going over a few practical details when I mentioned the hallway display. It was something we offered couples sometimes. Framed pictures of parents, grandparents, childhood moments, little pieces of history, so guests felt they were walking into a life rather than a production. I asked whether he wanted me to include the old photograph of our mother in her blue Sunday dress, or the one of him grinning on the Bell Street porch with one front tooth missing. He gave a short laugh and said, "We're keeping it cleaner than that." I said, "Cleaner than family?" He waved a hand. "You know what I mean. Chloe's side likes things a little more editorial." Editorial. That was the first time I felt the edge of something I could not yet name. A week later he mentioned, almost casually, that Chloe's father liked clear structures and might want basic background on our family holdings just to understand how things were organized. I asked him what exactly he meant by family holdings. He said, nothing dramatic. Bell Street, the venue, all that legacy stuff. He just likes to know who signs what. He said it lightly, but not lightly enough. I looked at him and said, "Why would he need to know who signs what?" Adrian smiled, though it came a second too late. because that's how people with money think. They want to know the map. Then he added a sentence that stayed with me longer than it should have. Technically, some things are in your name, sure, but practically it's all family anyway. That line settled somewhere in me and did not leave. I told him I would send whatever general property information was appropriate and nothing more. He seemed annoyed for half a second before smoothing it over. Then he said, "At some point I may need your sign-off on one or two future things, just to simplify perceptions." He tried to make it sound harmless, as if paperwork and perception were cousins. I did not like the sentence, but I let the moment pass, because people often say foolish things when they are trying too hard to sound important. After that, the exclusions started arriving in smaller, cleaner packages. Planning meetings moved off-site. Seating drafts circulated without me. A private family brunch happened that my daughter knew about before I did. When I asked Adrian about it, he blamed busy schedules, too many moving parts, crossed wires. The problem with repeated small slights is not the individual wound, it is the pattern. A man can excuse one oversight. He can excuse two if he wants peace badly enough. By the fourth or fifth, what remains is not confusion, it is instruction. Then came dinner with the Vales. I remember the restaurant because it served tiny portions at large prices, the sort of place that makes restraint look like luxury. Richard asked careful questions about Hawthorne House, but not the questions of a man making friendly conversation. He wanted to know whether the ownership structure was clean. He wanted to know whether succession planning had been formalized. He wanted to know if Bell Street was free and clear or carried intergenerational complications. Denise spoke less, but watched more. Chloe looked uneasy. Adrian answered most of it before I could. He said things like, "It's all stable, and the family side is consolidated, and we keep signatory issues streamlined." I turned to him once and said, "What signatory issues?" He smiled at Richard, not me, and replied, "Nothing worth boring everyone with." That was the moment I stopped assuming I was merely being edged out of wedding decisions. Something else was taking shape, and whatever it was, it involved making me appear less central than I really was. At home that night, I opened the old file cabinet in my den and reviewed the Bell Street papers and the Hawthorne House trust structure. Years earlier, when our father's old debts had tried to crawl back into the family through legal nonsense and pressure from men with bad timing, Ellen had pushed me to protect what little stability we had. So I did. Bell Street was not some loose family house anybody could present as leverage because his future father-in-law wanted to feel secure. It sat inside a restricted trust with occupancy conditions and clear limits. Hawthorne House operated through Mercer Holdings under my authority, with succession terms drafted carefully, not emotionally. Adrian had rights in some areas, privileges in others, but no power to sell, pledge, or represent either asset as if it were his to package for marriage optics. While I was reading, I found an old photograph tucked between two folders. Adrian was 16 in it, standing on the Bell Street porch in a graduation blazer that looked too big for him. I was behind him with one hand on his shoulder. Our mother had taken the picture. I could still hear her saying, "Stand still, both of you." I sat down with that photograph in my lap and felt the kind of tiredness that has very little to do with age. People think betrayal begins the day somebody lies. I don't. I think it begins the day somebody starts feeling ashamed of what you did for them. My daughter Sarah came by 2 days before the wedding with groceries and more honesty than I was in the mood for. She was 35, sharp, decent, and gifted with that dangerous quality some women inherit from good mothers, the inability to pretend not to notice disrespect. We were in the kitchen when she said, "Dad, why are you at table 9? I looked at her and asked what she meant. She told me she had seen one of the updated seating charts and my name was at the outer edge of the reception, not at the family table, not near the front, not even with our side properly grouped. She was angry already. I told her it was just seating. She said, "No, it's not. It's a message." I smiled because I had already thought the same thing. She reached across the table and touched my wrist. "You don't always have to prove you're the bigger person by swallowing it." That was a hard sentence to hear from your own child, because sometimes your children are the first to notice when your dignity has turned into a habit of endurance. Still, I decided I would go. I would wear the suit Ellen had liked best. I would sit where they placed me. I would not hand them a story about my absence. If they wanted me diminished, they could at least do it in front of my face. The wedding day was bright, in a way that felt almost cruel. Hawthorne House looked beautiful. The courtyard flowers were full, the staircase polish caught the morning light, and the old brick facade had that quiet dignity good buildings sometimes carry no matter what foolishness people bring into them. I arrived early, as I always did, using the staff entrance, because the front lane was already lined with cars and decorative signs. A few staff members greeted me awkwardly, which told me something was off before anyone had said a word. Then I reached the registration table, and the young woman with the clipboard clipped the badge to my jacket. When she said limited access, I thought I had misheard her. I looked down at the card and read it again, limited access guest. Underneath that, my name, not brother of the groom, not family, not host, just Daniel Mercer, reduced to a category. I asked who gave the instructions. She told me the groom's office. I thanked her because none of this was her fault, then walked 3 steps away and stood there holding my gift envelope so tightly the edge bent under my fingers. Paula, my general manager, spotted me from across the lobby. She had been with me for 9 years and knew my face well enough to tell the difference between irritation and injury. She came over, saw the badge, and said in a low voice, "What in the world is this?" I told her not to fix anything yet. She said, "Mr. Mercer, you own this building." I answered, "I know exactly what I own." That was the first time that day I heard the steel in my own voice. Once the ceremony guests began moving through, I started noticing how organized the insult really was. Gold access for immediate family and private lounges. Silver for top-tier guests. White for general admission. Mine had a red stripe, the only one I saw like it. When I tried to head toward the upstairs corridor where close family was gathering before photographs, a temporary security hire stopped me politely and said the level was restricted. He could not have been more than 24. He looked embarrassed before I even answered him. I asked how long he had been working there. He said, "Just for the event, sir." I nodded and stepped back. There was no point humiliating a young man who was obeying instructions he did not understand. My ceremony seat was in the 3rd row on the outer side. Not hidden, but not where a brother belonged. An older woman from Chloe's side sat near me and asked if I was with the groom's business circle. I said, "I'm his brother." She blinked, glanced toward the front rows, then looked back at me and said, "Oh." A single syllable can carry a surprising amount of pity. The ceremony itself was tasteful, expensive, polished, and emotionally hollow in a way that made me sad for reasons beyond my own pride. Adrian looked handsome. Chloe looked nervous. The officiant spoke about 2 families becoming one, and I noticed our mother's name was never mentioned, while 3 members of Chloe's extended family were thanked in detail. My daughter sat beside me with her jaw set so tightly I thought she might crack a tooth. When everyone stood for the vows, I remained calm, but something in me had gone from hurt to alert. After the ceremony, guests moved inside for cocktails and photographs. That was when the humiliation became impossible to misread. A coordinator with a headset called for immediate family to come upstairs for the private photo sequence. I stepped forward with the others. She checked her list, then my badge, and said, "I'm so sorry, sir. This group is gold access only." I said, "I am the groom's brother." She swallowed and answered, "I can only follow the event list." Then I heard Adrian behind me say, "It's fine. We've got a flow." I turned and looked at him. He was still wearing that public smile people use when they are trying to keep a performance intact. I held up the badge between two fingers. "Did you approve this?" He lowered his voice immediately. "Dan, not here." I said, "That isn't an answer." He exhaled, glanced around, then said the sentence I think I will remember for the rest of my life. We needed cleaner access boundaries. Chloe's family wanted things more structured. I said, "Structured enough to lock your brother out?" He rubbed the side of his jaw and said, "Please don't make this heavy. Today has to feel elegant." Elegant. There are words that reveal more than confessions. That was one of them. I stepped aside and told him, "Then don't worry. I won't disturb your elegance." He looked relieved, and that relief cut deeper than the insult itself. I went toward the library bar and stood there with a glass of sparkling water I never drank. From where I was, I could see guests moving through the hall, laughter bouncing off restored wood and old brick, staff balancing trays, sunlight filtering through the courtyard doors. I could also see Richard Vale speaking with Martin Feld from Eastgate Commercial Bank. I knew Martin. Hawthorne House had dealt with Eastgate for years on renovation financing and account management. I was not trying to listen, but when men speak carelessly in a familiar building, sound carries. Richard said, "Once the acknowledgement is handled tonight, the Bell Street piece should stop looking sentimental and start looking usable." Martin replied, "As long as beneficial control is actually where your side says it is." Richard gave a quiet laugh. Adrian assured us his brother is more ceremonial now than operational. Ceremonial. I felt something in me go very still. Martin said, "Then the sign-off shouldn't be an issue?" Richard answered, "That's what we've been led to believe." I walked away before they could notice me. Hurt was no longer the main issue. Strategy was. I went straight to my office through the service corridor. The office door still had the old brass handle Ellen used to polish with absurd seriousness every Christmas. Inside, I sat at my desk and looked through the wedding operations packet. I was not snooping. I was reading my own house. That is different. There were suite assignments, service notes, vendor timings, and one closed-door item scheduled between cocktail hour and dinner in the Marlowe room, private legacy discussion. Listed attendees included Richard, Denise, Adrian, Chloe, Martin Feld, and one blank line marked signatory, if available. If available. That was when the shape of it became clearer. They had not just wanted me embarrassed. They had wanted me managed, kept downstairs, kept away from documents, kept in a seat where my silence could be interpreted as compliance. I called my lawyer, Stephen Hales. He had drafted the trust structures years ago and was the kind of man who spoke mildly even when discussing disaster. When I explained what I had heard, he became quiet in that careful way lawyers do when a situation moves from unpleasant to dangerous. Then he asked, "Have you signed anything recently related to Bell Street or the venue?" I said no. "Has anyone been given full trust schedules?" "No." He sighed once and said, 3 weeks ago my office received an inquiry from a private consultant asking whether a beneficial transition was expected after the marriage. We declined to comment because no such transition exists. I assumed it was aggressive due diligence. I should have called you. I asked him plainly, "Do you think Adrian is representing assets he doesn't control?" Stephen answered, "At minimum, he may be implying authority he doesn't have. At worst, someone may have drafted around your consent." Then he added, "Do not confront anyone blind. Observe first." So I did. From the mezzanine overlook above the library hall, I watched Adrian move through the room with Chloe at his side. He looked good in that environment. Too good, maybe. Comfortable in the polished version of himself he had spent years trying to become. But I also noticed something I had missed before. Every time Richard came close, Adrian's shoulders changed. They tightened just slightly. His laugh became quicker. His posture sharpened, as if he were still trying to pass some private test. He was not just greedy. He was frightened of looking smaller than the room he had married into. That did not excuse anything. But it made him more familiar, and in a sad way, more tragic. I found Paula near the floral prep station and asked if any document packet had been brought through admin for private signatures. She said Adrian's assistant had delivered a navy leather folder to the Marlowe room an hour earlier. I told her, if that folder comes within copying distance, I need to see it. She nodded once. No questions. While I waited, my daughter found me in the east hallway under the old mirror Ellen had insisted on saving. Sarah looked at the badge still clipped to my jacket and reached up without asking. She removed it and held it in her hand like something stained. "Leave," she said. "Please, you don't owe them this." I looked at her, at the anger she was trying to keep decent, and I thought about leaving. There would have been dignity in it, but there would also have been surrender. If I walked out, they would own the version of the story that followed. Difficult brother, sensitive older man, family misunderstanding. "No," I said, "not yet." She searched my face for a moment, then handed me the badge instead of throwing it away. "Then keep this," she said. "You may need to remember what they thought of you." I folded it and put it in my pocket. 15 minutes later, Paula slipped into the service corridor carrying a thin print packet under a linen folder. "This should not exist," she said. I took the pages from her and read them one at a time. There was a draft memorandum describing a post-marital strategic alignment of legacy hospitality assets. There was a note presenting Adrian as operating principal over Hawthorne House, with anticipated full internal recognition. There was a page framing Bell Street as stable family property available for future leverage. And at the back was the ugliest thing in the stack, a copied acknowledgement page carrying something that was supposed to resemble my initials beside a typed signatory line. It was not my signature, not even close. Whoever did it had studied the shape but missed the hand. I had an old wrist injury from my 30s. My signature always dipped left in a place for reasons no forger would notice. This mark was neat, controlled, fake. For a moment I could not breathe properly, not because of the legal risk. Stephen could tear that page apart in minutes. What struck me was the intimacy of it. Adrian had not merely lied about me. He had tried to turn me into a usable absence. He had tried to replace my consent with a version of it. I called Stephen back and told him to come immediately. He said he was already on his way. Then I sat alone in my office for several minutes and made the hardest choice of the day. I could have gone straight into the Marlowe room. I could have stopped dinner. I could have called the police over the forged page and let the evening collapse in public. A younger man, or a meaner one, might have done exactly that. But I kept hearing my mother's voice from years ago, saying truth should be used like light, not like fire. So I drew a line for myself. I would not destroy the wedding ceremony that had already happened. I would not shame innocent guests for the sake of catharsis. But I would not permit 1 inch of false authority to pass through my building. They had chosen public presentation as their stage. If correction had to happen publicly, it would happen with facts, not fury. Dinner began at 7 under candlelight and soft jazz. The ballroom was beautiful in that expensive, controlled way people pay heavily for. My seat remained at table 9 near the outer edge. My daughter sat beside me. Across from us sat two men from Richard's firm and a cousin from Chloe's side, who kept glancing toward the head table as if waiting for the evening to reveal what kind of family she had married into. Stephen arrived quietly through the staff entrance and took a place near the rear wall beside Paula. With him came Lewis Grant, our accountant, a man in his 70s who had spent 30 years protecting numbers from people with charming faces and loose ethics. The first toast was harmless enough. Chloe's sister spoke warmly. Then Richard stood. He began in the polished language of fathers who believe a room belongs to them because microphones do. He talked about partnership, standards, shared values, and the joy of seeing two strong families come together. Then, slowly, he leaned toward the implication he had wanted all day. What is especially encouraging, he said, is knowing these two are not simply beginning a marriage. They are stepping into a meaningful legacy, one with history, assets, and the kind of foundation that can be stewarded wisely for generations. That was when I stood. I did not slam my chair back. I did not raise my voice. I simply stood, buttoned my jacket, and said, "Before that sentence hardens into fact, one correction is needed." The room quieted in pieces. Richard stopped mid-smile. Adrian set down his glass. Chloe looked from one face to another, already knowing this was no ordinary interruption. Adrian said first, sharply, "Dan, sit down." I looked at him and answered, "You handed me a badge at the door of my own building that said limited access guest. You can let me finish one sentence." That moved through the room like a change in weather. Richard tried a careful smile. "Perhaps this is something for later." I said, "Later is how false paperwork becomes expensive." Then I turned slightly and said, "Stephen, if you would." Stephen stepped forward with the folder. Lewis followed, carrying nothing but that severe expression accountants seem to save for moments involving fraud or wedding cake waste. Paula stood still near the back, pale but steady. Adrian rose from his chair now. "This is not necessary." Stephen spoke before I did. "Forgery makes necessity of many unpleasant things." The word landed hard. Chloe's face changed first. "Forgery?" she said quietly. Stephen placed 3 document sets on the side table near the head table. "These are draft materials circulated today regarding Bell Street and Hawthorne House. They assume control and authority that do not legally exist." He laid the second set beside them. "These are the controlling ownership documents. Hawthorne House remains under Mercer Holdings, with Mr. Daniel Mercer as sole signatory authority. Bell Street remains inside a restricted trust under his management. Mr. Adrian Mercer has no independent authority to sell, restructure, pledge, leverage, or represent either asset as his own." No one moved. You could hear cutlery settling. Richard stared at the papers. "That cannot be right." We were shown acknowledgement. Stephen lifted the forged page between 2 fingers. "You were shown a fabricated signatory page. It is not authentic." Adrian's voice came fast. "It was a draft, a placeholder." Lewis gave a dry, almost bored answer. "A forged signature is not a placeholder, Adrian." A murmur spread through the tables. Chloe looked at Adrian now with a kind of stunned stillness I will never forget. "Did you tell my father those properties were under your control?" He opened his mouth, closed it, then said, "I told him I handled the family side." She said, "That is not what I asked." He tried again. "I was going to formalize things after the wedding. I finally spoke then. With my signature, apparently." He turned toward me with anger and panic tangled together. "You always knew I'd be part of this eventually." I answered, "Part of it is not the same as entitled to it." He took one step forward. I was under pressure. For the first time all evening, the room saw something real in him. Not confidence, not polish. Desperation. "Do you have any idea what it's like," he said, looking half at me and half at the veils, To walk into rooms where everyone already assumes you're the weaker side, the less established side, the side with history but no structure? Richard stared at him in disbelief. Denise looked sick. Chloe said nothing. I said quietly, "So you thought if you borrowed my name and reduced my place in the room, you could look larger?" He swallowed and looked away. That was the true center of him. Not evil. Insecurity sharpened into dishonesty. Richard finally found his voice. "Adrian, did you knowingly present these assets as available in future planning?" Adrian did not answer quickly enough. Richard asked again, harder this time. "Did you?" Adrian said. "I presented the direction things were going." Stephen replied, "No. You presented fiction and attached a forged acknowledgement to support it." Chloe stood very slowly. Her hands were steady. That made the moment heavier, not lighter. She looked at Adrian and said, "Were you ever going to tell me the truth before I married you? Or was this the plan? Keep him downstairs, keep me smiling, and let the paperwork do the lying for you?" Adrian reached toward her. "Chloe, listen to me." She stepped back. "No. You listened. You made me stand in vows today while building the marriage on something false." There was a long pause after that. Not an empty one. The kind that changes futures. Then I took the folded badge from my pocket and placed it beside the forged page on the table. "This was clipped onto my jacket when I arrived," I said. "Limited access guest. I want everyone here to understand what that means. This was not a seating mishap. It was a strategy. I was to be visible enough to look included, and restricted enough to stay away from rooms where my silence could be used. I did not shout it. I did not need to. My daughter was crying quietly beside table 9. Her husband stood behind her chair with his hand on her shoulder. Several guests looked away. Others stared openly. Staff members kept their heads low, but I could feel their attention holding the room together. I said, "I am not here to destroy a wedding reception. Dinner will continue. Staff will be treated with respect. Guests will not be punished for the choices of a few people. But there will be no signing tonight, no discussion of Bell Street, no claim over Hawthorne House, and no further attempt to describe my role in this family as ceremonial." Richard's face had gone from offense to calculation to something like shame. "Mr. Mercer," he said, more carefully now, "had I known these facts, I would never have allowed this conversation to go as far as it did. I believed him. Arrogance and fraud are not the same thing. He was guilty of assumption, not invention." Denise said nothing at all. Chloe slipped off her wedding ring and set it beside her glass. No drama, no tears, just decision. Then she said, "I need air, and I need no one to follow me." She walked out through the courtyard doors. Denise half rose, but Richard touched her arm, and she sat back down. Adrian looked at me with a face I had seen only once before, years ago, when he was 14, and had been caught lying about something small but humiliating. Only this was not small. "You could have handled this privately," he said. I answered him with the plainest truth I had left. "I tried to be your family in private for half my life. You chose to use me in public." There was nothing he could say to that. Stephen spent the next few minutes making the practical matters clear. No document tied to Mercer assets would be recognized. Eastgate would receive formal notice. Any future communication would go through counsel. Lewis instructed our accounting office to freeze all external access to internal asset files and review every request made in the previous 6 weeks. Martenfeld from the bank, who had gone so silent he may as well have vanished into the wallpaper, finally stepped forward long enough to confirm nothing would proceed without full legal verification. Then, because responsibility does not disappear when your heart is breaking, I turned to the catering manager and said, "Serve the main course." The poor woman blinked, nodded, and carried on. Some guests left, some stayed, some suddenly found their phones very interesting. But the evening did not explode. It settled into truth. Later, after most of the room had thinned out and the jazz trio had been quietly dismissed, Adrian found me near the library doors. The flowers were drooping slightly by then. There is something fitting about seeing expensive arrangements begin to tire at the exact moment vanity does. He stood across from me with his tie loosened and said, "I never meant for it to get this far." I said, "That is not an apology." He looked exhausted, younger and older at the same time. I was trying to build something. With a forged sign-off? With momentum, he said bitterly. With timing. Once the marriage was secure, once Richard understood I could carry bigger responsibility, I thought things could be worked out. Worked out by whom? He said nothing. I asked him one question I needed answered. If you had come to me honestly and said you felt small in those rooms, that you wanted a clearer role, that you wanted your own standing without borrowing mine, would that have been too difficult? He laughed once, but there was no humor in it. You don't understand what it was like. I said, then explain it. He stared past me into the emptying ballroom. Every dinner, every conversation, every subtle little question from her father came down to the same thing. Was I the man I presented myself to be, or was I still the younger brother leaning on history? I got tired of being measured against what I didn't own. I said, "So you chose to pretend you did." He closed his eyes for a moment. I chose not to look weak, I answered, and that is how weak men usually begin. He flinched at that, because it was true. I told him Bell Street had to be vacated within 60 days for breach of occupancy conditions and misrepresentation of trust property. He looked up sharply. "Dan," I said, "I could pursue criminal review. I am choosing not to do that tonight." He whispered, "Because I'm your brother?" I shook my head. "Because I will not confuse destruction with justice." That was the last meaningful conversation we had that night. In the weeks that followed, everything became cleaner, colder, and more final. Stephen documented the forged page and sent formal notices where they needed to go. Richard withdrew all planned financial discussions with Adrian. Eastgate froze the expansion proposal. Bell Street was vacated, though I gave Adrian 75 days instead of 60, because some old loyalties die slowly even when they are deservedly wounded. Chloe moved out before the season changed. I heard later that the marriage did not survive long enough to become routine. I was sorry for her in a distant way. She had married ambition and discovered it was standing on borrowed ground. As for Hawthorne House, it kept doing what good buildings do. It held. Weddings continued. Music played. Guests laughed in rooms that had seen better hearts and worse ones. I came in less often that summer and let Paula carry more of the daily schedule. Grief returned in quieter waves then, the way it often does after a crisis passes, and leaves more room for older pain to sit beside newer disappointment. Some evenings, I would go home, make tea, and find myself standing in Ellen's garden longer than necessary. I would think about how quickly a man can be reduced in the eyes of others if he spends too many years making strength look easy. My daughter asked me once whether I regretted not stopping the ceremony itself. I told her no. A marriage that can be shaken by truth was already standing on weak wood. It did not need my anger to break. She nodded, though I could tell part of her still wished I had set the whole room on fire with facts sooner. She got that from her mother, too. Ellen had a soft voice and very little patience for cowardice. 1 month after the wedding, I found the gift envelope I had meant to give Adrian and Chloe still sitting unopened in my desk drawer. Ellen and I had set that money aside years earlier for family milestones. I added more to it and used it to create a small scholarship fund in Ellen's name for the children of our venue staff and maintenance crews. No public announcement, no brass plaque, just tuition help for families who worked hard and did not use love as leverage. That gave me more peace than I expected. Sometimes the best answer to betrayal is not punishment. It is redirection. Adrian and I did not fully reconcile. I do not believe in pretending over ruins and calling it healing. There were a few emails through lawyers, one message on my birthday the following year, and a short note after Christmas that simply said, "I know I failed you." I stared at that message for a long time before replying, "Take care of yourself." It was not forgiveness in the sentimental sense. It was restraint. People misunderstand forgiveness. They think it means restored access. Sometimes it only means you choose not to keep sharpening the blade. Months later, on a cool autumn afternoon, I was alone in the ballroom before another wedding. The chairs were set, the candles not yet lit, the windows holding the last pale gold of daylight. I went into my office and opened the top drawer. The folded badge was still there. Limited access guest. I held it in my hand and thought of my mother in that hospital room years ago. Weak but steady, asking me to promise that Adrian would never feel alone. I had kept that promise far beyond reason. What I had never promised was that I would let myself be erased. So I walked to the trash bin and dropped the badge in, not in anger, in completion. If there is a lesson in what happened, it is not that blood means nothing. Blood means a great deal. That is why betrayal by family reaches so deep and stays sore so long. But blood alone is not loyalty. And silence is not weakness. Sometimes a calm man is simply waiting until the truth can stand without help. My brother thought he had placed me at the edge of the room with a little card and a red stripe. What he really did was show me exactly who he had become. And when I finally answered him, I did it the way my mother would have wanted, with the truth in my hand and my dignity still intact.